So I wanted just to kind of create this very informal atmosphere. When a book comes out, you may have been working on it for years. You may have been working on it for 10 years, 20 years. This book actually took around six to seven. And it's a book in which I have thought about it in different ways since I began the project. I've come to entirely new understandings. So today, I'll just talk very briefly about what the book is about, what I found. And then I'd actually like to ask my co-panelists, co-lecturer Professor June Carbone from the University of Minnesota Law School, and Deborah Unger, LCSW, who is a mental health professional here in Bloomington who specializes in infertility counseling, to reflect on the project as well. And then we're just going to open it up and have a conversation. So the project got started, actually, although I didn't know it at the time, in 2007. And that's when my husband and I started going through infertility treatments after I had had a miscarriage. And we went through 3 IUIs, which is an intrauterine insemination, and none of those worked. And by the way, we were in Boston, and so all of this was free, which is a key point that comes into the conversation later. But we were on a clock, and the clock was ticking because we were going to move from Boston, so we were going to lose the great insurance that we had, which was saving us thousands of dollars. And so we had a couple bites at an apple, the IVF apple. For those of you who don't know, in vitro fertilization is a process where they fertilize an embryo outside the uterus. So they take sperm from a man, donor or an intended father, and they take an egg from a woman, either donor or intended mother, and they unite the two in a petri dish in one of several cultural mediums, and they grow the embryo from 3 to 5 days, and then they transfer the embryo or embryos back into the uterus of either a surrogate or an intended mother. And so that's the process we went through. And by the way, the person who's going to get that embryo has to take hormones for about 2 to 3 weeks beforehand. And they'll either transfer a fresh embryo that was just created a few days ago, or sometimes a frozen embryo that has been frozen sometimes for years. And so that is the process you go through. The average cost of an IVF cycle is $12,000. So Boston was, our Boston IVF experience was largely paid for by Harvard. Thank you, Harvard, which is where I was a fellow. I certainly did not have the capital to pay for that on my own. Another thing about the treatments is that they're quite emotional. It's emotional to find out that a part of your body that you always kind of took for granted doesn't work, or doesn't work the way you thought. It's awful to find out that there are limited resources, may be limited resources for people in your situation. And it's sometimes awful to find out that a problem that you think isn't your fault isn't covered by insurance, and thus might not seem like a medical condition, right? Yet people who make bad health choices, such as smoking, have cancer treatment covered. So infertility, it's a complicated dialogue, whether it's a medical disease, whether it's a medical condition at all, whether it's a lifestyle affair, that kind of thing. So fortunately, our own IVF process worked the first time. And something that's very relevant that I talk about in the introduction to the book, actually, is the fact that you have about, 30 seconds to a minute to decide how many embryos you're going to transfer back. We had agreed to have 2 put back, so we were going to chance twins. But at the last moment, we had 3 pretty healthy embryos. And the embryologist said, well, the third one's going to be happier inside you than outside you. And I'm usually a pretty scientific person in my thinking, but I thought of that lonely embryo. They don't like to freeze embryos by themselves. And I was like, well, let's go for it. Because the embryologist told me in that 30 seconds to a minute that we had a 3% chance of triplets. And if you know me, I won the lottery, right? And we actually got triplets out of that. After that, we had several difficult conversations about whether we would reduce our triplets down to 2 or even 1 based on health reasons, based on lifestyle factors. I just kind of wanted to be left alone. I was done with doctors at that point. So I took my chances and rolled my dice, and we have 3 boys that are 10 years old. And none of them really think that this story is cool or amazing, right? But I still think it is. And after I went through it, I began to really become fascinated by how people dealt with embryos when they died or got divorced, and like what happened, like the ethical problems of selective reduction. Because my doctor never told me that that might be a decision I would have to make later on if, in fact, the lottery worked and we got that 3% chance, you know? And I would have liked to hear about those conversations beforehand. And so I began to read law review articles and read what people had written about infertility in legal context, because I was teaching a class called Reproduction, Childhood, and the Law when I came to IU. And in fact, that's the class I taught my first semester. And I was determined to put a component on assisted reproductive technology in that course. Only a handful of people were teaching it at that time. I think more have started since. But it's really a microcosm of family law issues, and we can talk about how later on. And so I would have said when I was going through infertility that I was desperate, but I think my desperation drove me to research and find a good doctor and perhaps to be a little bit aggressive with the insurance company. But, you know, it's not, oh, woe is me, I'm desperate. You know, it wasn't that kind of desperation. But when I began to read law review articles, I began to hear that term a lot. And it was a kind of desperation that painted a picture of a woman who was helpless and powerless and didn't know what to do, didn't have options, was basically vulnerable to an unscrupulous medical provider. And the medical providers themselves were also portrayed as unscrupulous. You know, no doubt some are, but mine had not been. And so I began to want a diverse experience, a more diverse dialogue. The other thing that occurred to me was if we were saying that people who underwent IVF were desperate, what are we saying about people who are pregnant with unwanted pregnancies and who are considering abortion? Are they desperate? And you know, so could a lawmaker who was more interested in abortion than IVF pick up that topic and use it to support the idea that women were too emotional to make the abortion decision? We can see where that would lead, right? So I wanted to start talking to people about their experiences. When I did, I ultimately did 130 interviews with patients. I did 267 online surveys with a separate patient group from patients all over the country. And I did 83 professional surveys with everybody from doctors to nurses to people who ran front offices. There were 2 or 3 administrators in there, nurse coordinators, third-party reproduction or donor coordinators, and it was a very complex dialogue. So I'll just tell you, I'll give a brief overview of the book. So I wrote the book kind of in a chronology, what you would find going through treatment. And the first thing that you encounter is emotions. It's emotional to find out you're infertile. It's emotional to have to go to the doctor and go through the process of the testing. Moreover, when you're in this condition in your life, you're most likely surrounded by people who are not having these issues. And in fact, there might be people who get pregnant in your family spontaneously, right? So getting to see people with large families is painful. Your friends might not be the best people to talk with about it because they might, A, get tired of hearing about it, and B, have families of your own. And so a lot of what happens is that you end up looking for comfort and support within the clinic as well, not from necessarily your friends, but by the time people end up in an infertility clinic, when they've been through the gynecological gauntlet, when they get to the fertility clinic, they're looking to their doctors for emotional support in a way that you're not looking for emotional support after you have a stroke or after you're going to get your appendix out or something like that. It's a different kind of healthcare experience. Moreover, the treatments are really lengthy. You can have a treatment relationship with your doctor for months or years, you know, if you have endometriosis or some other condition that is related to infertility, or if you try cycle after cycle of treatment. You meet with doctors not in a gown, mostly, but in an office setting where both of you are fully clothed, where it's more like in some ways a business relationship or kind of like a mentorship relationship or a partnership of some kind, rather than just a solely medical, clinical relationship. And so that's the first part of the book, is explaining why people in my situation looked to doctors for comfort and support. Now, when you go into the doctor-patient relationship, this is where people have a lot of concerns because, you know, we think of unscrupulous providers being willing to take advantage of so-called desperate or vulnerable patients. And here I found very complex dynamics. So patients were looking for doctors who were competent, of course. That was probably the number one concern. But they also really wanted doctors who were good partners, good conversational partners, right? They wanted people who could put things clearly and succinctly. They looked for people who were warm, who were thoughtful, right? Who knew how exposed a woman could feel, how stigmatizing it was for a man to admit that his sperm didn't work the way they were supposed to, poor swimmers. How it was, how humiliating it was, how people in his office or her office were not used to failing, right? So sensitive, empathic, and the women who found those providers and the men who found those providers really valued those elements of the partnership. Doctors, on the other hand, talked about the importance of providing that. Only a few really admitted to knowing that this patient satisfaction experience was tied to being a good listener, and really talked about the commercial gains of trying to be an empathic person. Most genuinely were in that position because they wanted to help people, I believe. But then they also talked about some of the difficulties that we'll talk about in a second, about how IVF is a market, right? This is essentially you're paying a doctor for services. This is not a gratis service that most people get for free, and it's expensive. So women wanted perhaps more of a say in their treatment. Men wanted more of a say in their treatment than perhaps they should have. Perhaps they wanted twins when it's not medically advisable to desire twins because of health risks. Perhaps they wanted to try a new device or a new medicine that their friends in California with different health issues had tried when their doctor knew that it would be useless. And so it was just this dialogue of how to manage patients' expectations, I guess would be a better word, even when patients themselves wanted to go full throttle. Perhaps it was a conversation about directing them more to a counselor, a mental health provider, when they were just too caught up, and perhaps their competency was really imperiled if they were undergoing cycle after cycle after cycle and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on these procedures. And so it's basically what patients thought of doctors and doctors thought of patients. And ultimately, the third part of the book is where you reach the question, do patients have competency? And the numbers that I found were really startling. So there's a rich literature on the weaknesses of informed consent forms, right? People say patients don't read consent forms, patients don't understand consent forms, but that's really only where it gets started. So in IVF, granted, these are very well-educated, very well-off patients compared to many patients in other fields of care. So here are just a few of my numbers. When I asked patients, did they read the informed consent documents, two different groups, completely independent, 87% of surveyed patients said yes, 82% of interviewed patients said yes. When I asked whether they read embryo disposition forms, where they would choose what happened to embryos in case they died or got divorced, slightly higher, 92% survey, 89% interview. When I asked how carefully they read the forms, 90% of survey patients and 93% of interviewed patients said they read the forms with at least average attention. This is completely contradictory to what most people are finding in informed consent. Obviously, we'll start to unpack why. But then when I asked people if they understood the forms, it was even more off the charts. 98% of survey patients and 99% of interview patients found them to be of at least average comprehensibility. Now, there could be many reasons for this. Perhaps they read the forms in conjunction with a doctor, right? And so it's not just the forms that are comprehensible, but the conversation. But despite these numbers, people didn't like their forms. They liked talking to the doctors more. So they really liked that human element. They thought it was integral. They thought the documents provided legal kind of cover your ass protections for doctors, right? So they felt that they did not speak, the documents did not speak to them. They were so technical, so full of legal jargon, that even if they could be unpacked, they just weren't meaningful. What was meaningful were the conversations with providers. And of course, extrapolating out, the importance and the importance of trust in the doctor-patient relationship, I think, is really at the heart of my book. Trust enables women and men to discuss these most intimate of things with doctors to begin with. Trust is what allows a doctor and embryologist to handle the reproductive materials that you're going to use to create your children, right? And trust is what keeps you coming back to the same provider when things don't work out as you want that first time. But trust is actually being undermined in other ways by consent practices, particularly in other medical fields, but increasingly in infertility. So what's going on in infertility, in the infertility market, is that smaller clinics, doctors who prefer to practice on their own, they're being bought up. They're consolidating with larger clinics, partly because it's really expensive to run a good embryo lab on your own, partly because insurance is getting more expensive, but often because it's just easier to practice. It's getting easier to practice and in conglomerates. Some of these conglomerates are owned by hospitals. I would say that's very few, but Boston IVF would certainly be included in that. They're affiliated with Harvard. But increasingly, there's even these stranger entities that are gobbling up infertility clinics. For example, Integra Med, which is a company that used to provide kind of back office services like marketing and legal services and website maintenance and patient portals to fertility clinics, now actually has started buying fertility clinics. They're privately held. But what happens is that if you're being gobbled up by a conglomerate, the same standardized practices are going to apply to your practice as well. And so we've seen appointment times get shorter in medicine. We've seen an increasing amount of emphasis being placed on electronic medical records and bookkeeping at the expense of patient personal relationships. And I think that is going to go into the heart of the fertility relationship, where I think in some ways this relationship is a dinosaur in the medical care field at this point. So when are patients supposed to form these relationships and form this trust, right? And then when you get these conglomerates, you get an emphasis back towards documents, back towards paperwork, right? Which is the last thing that patients want. And the last thing that I think really makes the informed consent, the infertility process bearable, right? Because at the end, when you're waiting to conceive your family, I think one of the only things that keeps you hanging on is the knowledge that your doctor believes in you, right? Not that your forms are airtight, but that your doctor is there behind you as well as your medical team. You know, it becomes a team effort. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Deborah Unger. No, but because I think you can really pick up this emotional part of this. And then we'll redirect to June. Mm-hmm.
Well, I hadn't really prepared a summary. I mean, I'm really honored to be here. It's a privilege. This is an incredible project that Jody has put together. And her research, as she described very well from beginning to end, her purpose in really, just having completed the final draft, I just hadn't prepared the notes right now to give you a summary as she did. But,
well, how do you think emotion factors into that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just love the fact that she took the care to research people, to do the research and interview these women, and the testimony in here is incredible, where they are able to talk about, you know, all the different feelings that they're having going through the process, all the different challenges they're having. As Jody talked about, there's a huge amount of isolation that happens for women that are going through this because they really cannot talk to their friends and family openly about what they're going through. So that isolation just sort of compounds the stress, the struggles that they're feeling, the decision-making that they have to take on, all on their own, and hopefully with the collaboration of a good doctor, which may or may not be there to hold their hand through all those different decisions. So I think what I can share is that from my experience in my practice, I will see patients come to me and talk about all the different emotions that they're experiencing, and it could be a tremendous amount of anxiety, depression, despair. But with those emotions, I see that patients take that and they convert it into sort of an empowerment to say, hey, this is something I really, really want. I have a really hard time. I had a hard time reading the chapter on desperation. I kept wanting to play with that term. And I finally had to turn it to desire. Because I do think it's a pejorative term. And I think you did a really great job debunking it and saying, hey, you know what? These women really want this. They desire a family. It's a perfectly so with those feelings, I see patients turning to research. And they turn to a very, very thoughtful process of researching what's out there. What are other people going through? They get online, they read all the different websites. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're discussions for places, walls where women get together, and I don't actually know what those walls are saying, but a lot of people will say it just exacerbates their anxiety because people typically turn to those walls to share their scariest, horrible stories. And in fact, I think you say in here, but they don't go back and say, hey, it worked out. I had a great experience. I'm pregnant now. You kind of turn to that when you're feeling sad, but not when you have your resolve and your family in the end. So what I like about the whole, one of the incredible takeaways of the book is that, yes, women experience a lot of emotions, but they take those emotions and they become very, very thoughtful researchers, and they gather information from beginning to end, and they fully engage in that process of decision making and making thoughts about what kind of treatment protocols are going to be the best for them. And yes, sometimes they might turn to friends or procedures that might not be the best fit, as she talked about, but you can have those conversations with your doctor. You need to bring them up and say, well, what about this matter? What about this? And use that to come to a collaborative decision about what's the best treatment protocol and to take you to full term, hopefully, in a pregnancy and conception.
So let me say, I have been talking to Jody about this project since its inception. Seeing it born and concrete and here is enormously exciting. And one of the things it does is to change and to greatly enrich the legal framing of what the questions are about. So I've been working on assisted reproduction, probably since Baby M hit the national headlines. For some people in the audience, that was a long time ago. But when you go to conferences, and there's a whole group now in the Legal Academy that talks about baby markets, one of the things you get is a deep ambivalence about what this is about. So on the one hand, law professors who always focus on what can go wrong, are deeply skeptical of unregulated markets. You have a situation where patients are mostly paying out of pocket, and doctors, to stay in business, need to be able to recruit patients. And so you have skepticism of the market framework from day one, but you have coupled with that as well deep skepticism about government regulation of anything related to reproduction, certainly in this era. So that combination is a worry about exploitation, and often taking the form that Jody talks about of a focus on this image of desperate women because then they're in need of rescuing by lawyers. And the question of what the alternative framework is also deeply scary. I mean, I testified last year before the Minnesota Surrogacy Commission, and the Minnesota Surrogacy Commission would love to ban surrogacy. But in the state of Minnesota, there are neither the votes to adopt any law on surrogacy or to ban it. So what you have is no law being created on the ground, but the few decisions that exist that you can find are depublished because the courts don't want to weigh in a way that would have precedential value. So what you're talking about is creating an industry, a set of practices on the ground without a whole lot of oversight. And the question of how that happens involves something that I really learned from Jody's work and I think has been incredibly insightful. And that is to talk about the way you have a medical model based on an idea of consent with forms written by lawyers who play CYA, what can go wrong, make sure the patient has been informed of what can go wrong, and make sure they sign so if it goes wrong, the doctor is not liable for malpractice. But there is another part to the idea of consent, and indeed at least two pieces that I think are beautifully captured in this book. One is the idea of patient as partner. After all, when you're talking about assisted reproduction, you're not talking about a medical model where the patient has no choice. I have a friend who passed away from leukemia this week, and there were some agonizing choices about treatment. But the alternatives to treatment were to accept you're going to die in fairly short order. This is a different kind of decision-making about a medical process. It's elective, and there are a series of choices about how to structure it, what to engage in, what to do. And the patient should be a partner in that decision. And it's not just about what can go wrong. It's also about what are the best chances for things that might go right. But there's a second piece, and I think this is the piece where the book is really most informative, and that is patient as consumer. So even with regular doctors where you have your copay, for an ordinary kind of medical treatment upon which the model is based, there's typically insurance in the background, and even if there isn't, there is an opaque fee schedule you will never understand. And the fertility industry is quite different. So you don't have exactly consumer as shopper, comparison shopping at price, but you do have patient as consumer making decisions about what they can afford. And the greatest concerns about exploitation have not been so much about people in the fertility business as patients, as much as it has been patients as consumers, who may be undertaking procedures with low odds of success and paying money they can't afford because of this idea of desperation. Mm-hmm. So to me, what the book does, and does beautifully, is to capture the multifaceted nature of decision-making, where the patient is also a consumer, and this is partly about shopping, and it is partly about the pros and cons of various kinds of medical treatments, but it is ultimately about a partnership with a provider. And that perspective, I think, lays a foundation for a notion of informed consent. So going forward, and I think the book will be enormously influential on this going forward, what is about to come down the pike is all kinds of innovation. So egg freezing is now already here, but new gametes created in the lab is probably the next step. And procedures that we don't know whether they work because nobody's tried them yet are on the horizon. And in that, the question of what does it mean to consent, where you don't know if it works and you're paying a lot of money out of pocket and the technology is untried and you can't test it first because no one is willing to pay for the testing. Those are the next set of issues coming down the pike. And I think this frames the questions going into this beautifully because it gets at the idea that consent is not CYA. Did your lawyer put your lawyer being the doctor's lawyer, put the right things in the consent form? But rather, how do you engage decision-making about things where the big risks may be financial or the answers may really be unknowable? Mm-hmm. And that's what I think this captures, is that process.
And I think those questions are really valid because what's happening is, especially now, you're seeing a whole bunch of treatments on the horizon which are not FDA approved. So a clinic might coordinate with a clinic in Mexico or a clinic in Toronto and send patients there. For example, to use the mitochondrial DNA of another woman's egg, a younger woman's egg, to insert into the egg of a woman who cannot conceive to form a healthy embryo. We're talking about research that other countries are doing, but that we cannot do here in the United States. And what problems exist? Informed consent, designers, doctors, in some ways venture capital, entrepreneurial types have looked around and they said, well, let's come up with a solution. Let's get away from documents and let's go to multimedia programs. But in some ways, it creates a better opportunity, I think, to visualize the process. But in some ways, they have the same risks as documents, right? And here, there's another danger that the doctor who uses a document is probably always going to have a conversation with the patient. But if you are going through an informed consent multimedia presentation and using that to prepare you for your doctor conversation, that's one thing. But providers who are tight on time, tight on even maybe emotional support capital, might look to these platforms as ways to outsource the conversation to begin with, right? So if you're e-signing that multimedia consent form and you have an opportunity to email a question to your medical team, boy, that really shortchanges patients in some dangerous ways, right? Last night at dinner, we had a fabulous exchange with Yvonne Cripps, Professor Cripps, and Professor Carbone, where we were talking about companies that were basically planning to sell you medical or advertise medical services to you based on your Google searches. And here again, that makes an end run around the doctor-patient relationship. So what's going to happen is that there's all of these threats to the doctor-patient relationship. And how are we going to respond? So at this point, I'd like to open it up to conversation. And I think we have microphones going around the room. So what questions do you guys have about this process or where we are that you guys would like to talk about?
So you talked about, Professor Carbone, you talked about consumer and, shopping for a fertility clinic. And this reminded me of a case forever ago about pharmacies advertising for drugs and whether they were able to do that. Are fertility clinics advertising how much they charge? Are we actually able to determine that before you've established a doctor-patient relationship? That seems like a fairly complicated way of finding out exactly how much you're going to pay until you know what procedure you need, and then at that point, are you even able to change clinics or change doctors after you've established that relationship? Is there an actual choice involved in how much you're spending?
Yeah, let me comment on the way it's changing, and I think you should answer the rest of the question. One of the things that, again, is striking, and even after having written in the field as a law professor for a number of years, I was still startled to discover, is what has happened up until now is that fertility clinics in the United States mostly operate with cartel-like pricing. So on the one hand, you have a sophisticated patient population where you don't even think about it unless you can afford $10,000 out of pocket. On the other hand, becoming a reproductive endocrinologist is expensive and takes years of study. So there are barriers to entry. And as a result, what you typically had in most places, and certainly in a place like Bloomington, would be a small number of providers who charge fixed prices and don't much negotiate. And so if you want, you talk to the doctor, but shopping around wouldn't get you anything. The thing that is dramatically changing this is the online market and the possibility of geographic mobility. So what you see online now, and every time I've taught the course, I go online and Google fertility clinics and see what they're pitching. And what they're pitching right now is sex selection and the ability to go abroad. So you don't see, you have some clinics that you can fill out a form and they'll tell you what they charge. You don't see a lot of direct price competition. What you do see are larger clinics or clinic brokers that advertise. We have offices in 42 countries, including Mexico and India. Mm-hmm. And when you unpack that, what you're finding is they bring the wealthy of the world to the United States, and they are sending Americans who run out of money to Mexico. And that price competition is more robust than the competition between doctors in the same city. Mm-hmm. You want to?
So there is a really wonderful article that I can refer you to if you're curious more about the websites and how they target. It's by Jim Hawkins. I forget the exact title of the article, but it talks about how fertility clinics actually advertise in problematic ways. Websites are full of white babies. They're not really full of price disclosures, but then they've also started to pick up on auxiliary types of markets by offering these other services. Many are offering surrogacy packages as well. Going into finances, sometimes the waters get muddied because it's not just this a la carte kind of cycle pricing, but they'll do something called shared risk, which is when so if an average cycle takes 10 to 12,000, you can pay 25 to 30,000 and get 3 cycles. So if you conceive on the first cycle, then the clinic wins. If you conceive on the second, you break even. If you conceive on the third, then you clearly have made out. But if you don't conceive at all, you might get a large percentage of that $25,000 to $30,000 back. And what that does, it's very attractive to patients because then they don't have to go to their partners each time and say, can we open the checkbook? Can we open the checkbook? Can we open the checkbook, right? Which is, again, part of the emotional burden of this. But again, where you're also going now, which is most problematic, is I talked about Integra Med earlier, where that back office provider is now gobbling up fertility clinics. What they're doing is they're using a uniform patient portal where you can go on, you can see your patient record, you can see your test results, but you can also apply for financing on that very same website. So you don't have a financial counselor anymore that you have to see at the clinic. You can do that right now like a used car loan. And the way that those packages are being sold to women and couples going through infertility, it's very problematic. So for example, they would say the cost of a take-home baby. It's not the cost of treatment, it's the cost of a take-home baby, as in the price is framed in success. So it's really problematic. Again, there's no intermediary.
And let me add that places that offer those kinds of options, unlimited trials, also screen for
Yes.
candidates who have high prospect of success.
Yeah. And
So you have to be approved.
yes. And what's it like when you get kicked out?
Yeah, well, I haven't had clients of that, but I can imagine that would be extremely painful to
Right.
be rejected from a trial or to feel it's just one more, barrier to treatment. Also, I didn't disclose that I did go through this as well. I don't really think you could become a mental health provider without having the experiences to be able to benchmark those feelings and everything that you go through in the process. And the one thought that came to my mind around pricing is that we did learn probably 6 months into it, a few cycles into it, that, we can get our drugs from Canada. And so we were getting, you shop around, you look for the, where you can get the best deal. You're going to trust Canada maybe before you're going to trust Mexico. But probably throughout the entire process that we went through infertility treatment, I was always thinking, well, wait, should we just go to New York City? Should we be going to California? I mean, what's going to give us our best chance of success? But the problem with relocating, as you can imagine, it's already expensive. So with $12,000 for one IVF cycle, imagine giving up, you'd have to actually leave your job. So you're looking at, a couple where they could actually relocate and not work, take leave. I mean, what kind of money do you have to make to be able to leave your job for really, a month, 2 months, how many cycles you're going to try? I mean, that's a pretty huge economic divide for access to having a family. Do we want that?
Other questions?
So I can't wait to read this book. It sounds so important. I want to say both for policymakers and judges and others involved, but also just for people who have family members and friends, who go through this, to help understand what people are experiencing, which I think many of us have had that, even if we haven't ourselves, and understand why they can't go to another friend's baby shower, and it's just especially important, obviously, for reasons you described when you're talking about women seeking health care and the stereotype of women being overly emotional and desperate, and that really affecting judges and policymakers, and the analogy to women seeking abortions, so important, because we've seen the Supreme Court justices ignore data and evidence that you're helping provide here in comparable situations where they say, of course the evidence is to the contrary, but we know just our common sense is women are going to come to regret their decisions. So wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to it. One thing that, two things I guess that was going through my mind, about 14 years ago, I lost my father and my mother-in-law to cancer, and so I was thinking about similarities where you have, and Professor Carbone, you mentioned leukemia. So I wanted to hear more, and Jody, you alluded to this, about the differential access to these medical care generally, obviously, but here it's even more so when you're talking about an elective procedure. But in the, I was thinking like my own, economic privilege. When my father, who was a letter carrier and had no friends who were doctors or anything, his doctor he just happened to go to, stage 4 cancer in both cases. You just have no, in that context, desperation is, I think, an apt word because it's about whether you're going to live and how long when you're stage 4. But the initial doctor was awful and prescribed a very aggressive form of chemotherapy that, most people in my father's kind of situation, you just go with it, and he tried to get a second opinion from a really renowned person who wasn't taking new patients. So I, privileged person now that I am, had a good friend who was the head of oncology at a major hospital, and I was able electronically to send him the records, and he said, this is, talk to me not as a patient, but, this would be insane. If this was my father, there's no way, I'd put him through this. So, I just want to invite you to talk more, I guess, about the just incredible effect of privilege and disparate access to healthcare and second opinions. And then he got him in to see the doctor who wasn't taking new patients, kind of thing, too. Mm-hmm. So, just the realities, and wondered if you had more to say from your book about that, Jody.
Sure. Yes, and I think that's a really complex problem because, and perhaps in different ways in infertility, because if you may switch doctors before you really should, just because your doctor's refusing to follow your treatment plan that worked for your friend who has different issues, right? But assuming you have real questions about your physician's competence, it's hard. There are barriers to access that actually, are not found that often in other forms of medical care. So in a rural area, you might have a heart doctor. Even in Bloomington, we don't have a person who does IVF. You have to go an hour up the road. And so for some people, going an hour up the road is a big hardship. So I think even among people who can afford IVF, there's people who have their life savings in it, who have refinanced their house, who are using credit cards, and a cycle is all they can afford. So even if they're privileged enough to get to that point where they can get in the door, they can rapidly run into other barriers. For example, and they might just have that one bite of the apple, or they might be in a position to say one IVF cycle or one adoption, because an adoption could run, 12 to 25,000. So what are you going to do? But if you broaden that to look at, the high rate of infertility among minority populations, the lack of access to care that they get, even from OBGYNs who often do the first line of fertility treatments. I think that's a very serious problem. And again, this is a different conversation, but the stakes are higher too. Again, it's not life or death, but if you're going to have just one or two bites of the apple, if you can get in the door at all, you're more likely to risk it all in one IVF cycle, and then you're going to transfer those 2 to 3 embryos because you're never going to get back there again. And you might have the twins or triplets. There was a woman in the hospital with me when I was in my final 3 weeks of bed rest in Brigham and Women's Hospital. She lost 2 of her triplets because they were born too early. And that's a real consequence, and that can be heartbreaking. So smart decision-making comes with insurance coverage or greater financial means as well. Yeah.
So Dawn, I like that you're kind of broadening this as well to kind of looking at our relationship with healthcare in general, because what I found going through it and then working with other clients is that really, as Jody's talking about it, it has to be a collaborative relationship, discussions that you have with your doctors around what type of treatment would be best. You want to understand your options and participate in joint decision making. Maybe more infertility treatment than other areas, but I believe in many, many other areas. After I was lucky enough to have 2 children, when you have kids, you go to the pediatrician. You have all those wellness visits that go on forever. They get sick, you go back to the doctor. Well, it taught me that really all of those visits need to be collaborative. We need to talk to our doctors about what they think is going on with your child. What could this be? What tests are you going to run? What are my choices? Do I need to, what are the downsides of doing this test or the downsides of giving this antibiotic to my child who you don't even have a definite diagnosis that they do have strep? What are the downsides of giving your kids antibiotics for something that hasn't actually been proven to be a problem? I think going through this and learning about what women can do and having these conversations and collaborating in your own healthcare treatment is really going to be useful for anybody engaging in treatment with cancer treatment. There are a lot of decisions that need to be made in most situations. The other piece that I think is really interesting is that increasingly providers are making decisions about our health care based on what they think insurance is going to approve, not based on what's best for us. So we need to be cognizant of that constantly. We need to be thinking, when we talk to a doctor, are they rushing us out because whatever, they're not going to make more money if the session goes 10 more minutes? Did they share all the different options? Did they deny me? Did they not even discuss a test because they thought the insurance company wouldn't pay for it? So they didn't even bring it up. That's unethical, but it's happening all the time. So we need to be aware of engaging and collaborating in our own healthcare treatment with, everything that we're going through, and feel comfortable having those conversations. And I think she talks very clearly about what those conversations could look like.
And there's
and can I want to comment too.
Just a quick follow-up. What happens when you don't have the opportunity for those conversations is actually that people get proactive in ways that are dangerous to their own health. So if you can't go into an OBGYN, even if you're denied even that access, you can still order drugs like fertility frontline drugs called Clomid, which increases the amount of eggs that a woman may produce in any given menstrual cycle. This is really dangerous because when a doctor prescribes Clomid, often what they will do is do ultrasounds to see how many eggs you're producing. And so if you've got 4 or 5 coming up out of the hopper, unscientific term, they will tell you, hold off, do not have sex this cycle, right? Because you might have multiples and that is devastating. But if you're using Clomid, you don't have any idea what to take. You don't know how you are going to perform on it. You may not even know if you're going to need it. And you don't even know if the Clomid you're ordering from India is really Clomid at all. So women have taken this and actually lost both their ovaries in the process. The other thing is that clinic staff do make judgments based on how patients act when they come into the office. If you act like the sort who is financially desperate, this is your one bite at the apple, they wonder how you will afford the child that you might conceive through IVF, and they might not work as hard for those types of patients. So I think you had a question, and then Laura.
I was going to comment a little bit. When you look at healthcare in general, I mean, the healthcare debate has totally frustrated me in its dishonesty and its assumption that people can't understand something that's a little bit more complicated. So George Will, of all people, finally said what I think has to be the starting point for a discussion of this, which is if you provide insurance for some people and not other people, it skews everything. So when you look at healthcare in the United States right now, the single biggest tax subsidy in the federal budget is employer-provided health care. And because a lot of fairly privileged people have employer-provided health care, that increases the price people who don't have insurance pay out of pocket for routine procedures. So that people who don't have employer-provided insurance aren't engaged in a free market system. They're engaged in a system that is skewed by the availability of insurance for some things. Now, up until now, it's been true that the fertility business largely is paid for out of pocket. But one of the things that is rapidly changing it is increased insurance coverage. And that also skews what kind of services clinics are eager to provide and what prices they charge. And it skews it in both directions. With insurance coverage, you see a greater incentive to provide lower cost, more routine services where they can increase volume. And you may not be at all aware that your choices in one city versus another may depend on whether the state mandates insurance coverage or not. But bear in mind, what is increasing insurance coverage of IVF is that employers with high-end employees who are eager to keep women of childbearing age and encourage them to delay are finding offering IVF coverage, like Apple offering egg freezing coverage, is a draw in keeping a high-skilled female workforce. But that then affects the prices, the services, and everything else available to people who are paying out of pocket. So this whole picture is more complex. Final note, maternal mortality, women who die in childbirth. California has dramatically reduced its incidence. Texas, it is dramatically increased. And when you say why, if you care about your patient population and engage in science-based research and extend insurance coverage for basic procedures like follow-up visits, you have dramatically better outcomes. And we're not doing that at a basic level. It's hard to talk about mandating insurance coverage for IVF if we're not covering well baby visits.
Right, right.
Well, I was trying to think of other medical markets. I was thinking of other medical markets that are comparable, and there are some recent high-profile cases about the rehab industry that's becoming more commercialized, and then when there are deaths that result from those less regulated places, there's legal implications, and then we're raising questions about how to make sure that those are safe for people. So I wonder if you see any parallels between this medical service providing and then the rehab industry.
Yes, so the rehab industry, that's kind of like the physical therapy, which is kind of like the first line for everything, right? Nowadays, if you get a broken finger, they want to send you to physical therapy. It's a way of outsourcing. Doctors are so busy now that they used to provide those services themselves, and it's a way for them to basically keep their patient volume down in ways where they'd have to dismiss the patient anyways because they can't cover it. But it's also a way for them to outsource some of the risk, right? Because you can imagine what a lot of these procedures entail. I think that there's, in some ways, the holistic medicine, acupuncture, chiropractic care is also much of the same. Actually, I think that's a really good area for future research. Because what you're doing too is, while doctors talk to rehab providers, and in fact, a lot of, for example, Bloomington Bone and Joint basically swallows and then offers as part of Bloomington Bone and Joint a rehab facility, you know? So it's a form of conglomerization. But the other thing that happens too is what happens when you're outsourcing risk to another provider, and yet the doctor's continuing to follow your care when you're under this chiropractor, or you're under an acupuncture therapist, or you're under a holistic medicine provider who the doctor doesn't talk to on a regular basis or at all. So I think these stretched medical relationships are fruitful areas where things can go wrong. Fruitful areas of litigation, yeah. So, I think Laura Foster had a question.
I was just going to ask, in terms of your interviews with folks, if you saw any distinctions along the lines of sexual orientation or race.
Yes, so the fact is that this is a very white practice. It's a very white heterosexual practice. And if you want to recruit same-sex couples, which I'm actually working on a project doing that right now, you have to really go out into special same-sex forums, for LGBTQ. And because those people don't join the same fertility forums, they might not even go to the same clinics a lot of the times that heterosexual people will. In large cities, everyone goes to the most successful clinic they can afford, but certain clinics get a reputation among certain communities for success or willingness to work. One thing that immediately stood out to me in my provider interviews is that they basically said, well, we're starting to see those people now, but I can always think of a nurse who wouldn't want to see them or who would treat them differently, who wouldn't really think they were a family. And so I think I was very surprised by the judgmental comments some individuals made about whether or not LGBTQ were entitled to form families through such services to begin with, which was enormously sobering, right? Because we thought of, they've been doing it for years, right? But I think, if it looks like that in fertility, what does it look like in adoption, right? But I think, fortunately, there's a lot of communication in those communities where they go to places where they feel safe, where they get effective treatment, And I think certainly with recent legal developments, you can really see those comments, those attitudes becoming a thing of the past.
Okay. Hi. So there was some discussion that in certain areas there is no legislation, so people are creating those laws on the ground. Mm-hmm. So I was hoping you could speak about what that looks like, and then also how we make that legislation a possibility.
Sure. Okay, so 2 examples. The first is after Nadia Suleiman had her octuplets, Georgia tried to pass a law where they were going to redefine the IVF process. You could only create, you could get as many eggs as you could, and you could get as much sperm as you could, but you could only create, I think, 1 or 2 embryos at a time. And the problem is that when you are going through IVF, there is a series of statistical calculations that take place. So no matter how many eggs you retrieve, on a statistical level, 75% of those will fertilize, and fewer of those will be viable on day 3, fewer still viable on day 5. So that creates an incentive for people to go to other states, go to other countries. I mean, this is what you have in Italy, other countries in Europe, where people engage in reproductive tourism to avoid such restrictions. And that legislation was by and large not created in collaboration with the reproductive endocrinology community in Georgia. It didn't pass either, but it seems really, it sounds good. The second is the embryo right to life legislation, where you couldn't do research on particular embryos, for religious reasons. Those that, or the embryo personhood legislation efforts, those have failed. The third and most recent that I'm aware of is actually a different kind of regulation, and it's a regulation to punish doctors who actually are unscrupulous. So in December of 2016, an Indianapolis fertility doctor named Dr. Donald Klein became indicted for obstruction of justice for basically using his own sperm to fertilize patients from 1970s, late 1970s through late 1980s. I'm actually working on a book project where I'm interviewing these individuals. And the doctor thus far has been held accountable only for obstruction of justice, and he's been given a suspended sentence and fined $500 for. And by the way, this only came out when the siblings, the children created through these efforts, started doing 23andMe and found out that there were 5 other siblings in the same city. There's now 24 known children and 11 waiting to go through the testing. So the Indiana General Assembly tried to push through a fertility fraud bill, which would make it a crime to use their gametes, eggs or sperm, without their consent, without the patient's consent, although it shouldn't even be available with the patient's consent. Yes, conflict of interest. Also a crime to use embryos belong to other people or eggs or sperm belong to other patients without consent. That didn't go anywhere, but we have hopes of pushing it through next year.
Yeah, although I had a very different take on that, and that's if you look at second parent adoption, that is adoption by a second parent of the same sex,
Yes.
And then the surrogacy lawyers have used the same process. Mm-hmm. It is a set of legal opinions about how adoption, which was never intended to deal with second parent adoption, what the adoption statutes allow. And then you find a friendly judge, a judge you know will approve the adoption petition, and you go before that judge. And then, it doesn't matter whether it's Kansas or California. When California finally ruled on that, there were 20,000 children who had parents through this process, and no way the California California Supreme Court was going to say to 20,000 children, the person you think is your legal parent is not.
Right.
That's what I mean by facts on the ground.
Yeah. I think we have time for one question. I know it's past 1 o'clock, so we'll have to end fairly soon. But Yvonne, do you have a quick question?
Yes, first of all, to thank you, Jody, for your wonderful work in this area and all that you bring to it. And to respond, first of all, quickly to Dawn and to her point about the treatment of relatives with cancer, there are some fascinating new diagnostics now, and a company called, in particular, Oncotype DX, that enable you to take a sample and determine whether chemotherapy is likely to work and even how likely to work. Now, this, of course, in addition to saving huge amounts of suffering and patients and families, could save the healthcare system, and is already doing so, in fact, millions of dollars. And I mention it in part because our laws do not really encourage or dramatically incentivize the production of these diagnostics in the same way that we incentivize the production of pharmaceuticals. So a single pharmaceutical, I mean, it can earn huge percentage profits for a company, but a diagnostic, very little profit in the way our system is structured at the moment. The other point I would make very quickly in relation to the wonderful research that you have done and are doing, Jody, is that I'm reminded, pardon me, of the Mayo Clinic, which is such a successful organization financially across several campuses, and operates on a model of giving the patient as much time with the doctor as the patient wants. So the appointment actually doesn't have a limit of time on the doctor's schedule. And it's interesting that people come from all over the country and all over the world, and that using that model, the Mayo Clinic is also very financially successful.
Yes, so the two go together, and hopefully clinics who don't keep those two together will suffer in the long term. I'd like to thank you all for coming today and helping me to celebrate this accomplishment. Thank you.
And the book is available for sale if you want to buy it someplace.
Amazon.
Amazon.